SVOD library composition and effectiveness are revealed in new Nielsen and Gracenote data. YouTube's dominance on TV grows and Google's startling genAI tools. Listen on.
Welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Stream. This is Will Richmond from Video News. And that was Colin Dixon's voice there at the beginning from In-Screen Media. Hey, Colin, how is your post-Memorial Day weekend going?
It's going really well. The very quiet week this week and last week in our business, Will. And we're going to do, I think, a little bit of a round the horn today. There are several stories that are interesting that we want to bring up, but none that quite raise to being a main theme for the podcast, right?
Right. Nothing too huge this week. We have a couple of stories focusing on data from Nielsen to get us started. You've looked at the Gracenote data, and then I'll talk a little bit about the Gauge data.
Indeed. So, yeah, as you mentioned, Gracenote has created a thing they're calling it the Data Hub, and we'll include a link to that Data Hub in our posting so that you can go and look at this data yourselves. And basically what they're doing is they're looking at the libraries of all of the top SVOD providers and giving us a snapshot of the profile on those libraries. And it's pretty interesting, Will, because it sort of confirms some things that the providers are telling us. We can actually see at least according to Gracenote, that what they're telling us is actually true. So I want to sort of dive into a couple of the tidbits from this data. But there is a lot more there. So if you want to check it out, as I say, come on to either of our sites and click on the links to the data. So I guess the first thing is they talk about several groupings like content video distribution and content composition. And I guess I want to start with content composition because that one it's got some quite surprising conclusions on the content composition graphs. And so one of the things that we know about SVODs is that they've been moving quite heavily into sports, and they've been doing it in two ways. One is, of course, they've got live sports. And the other way is that they're producing sports-related content, shoulder content. So I'm thinking of things like Welcome to Wrexham on Hulu and Need for Speed on Netflix, so that type of things. And so it's become a small but growing part of what they offer. And I say small, and it is a pretty small part of their total video distribution. For example, in Q2 2025, Gracenote says that about 13,000 titles in all of those in the libraries of Prime Video, Apple TV Plus, Disney Plus, Netflix, and Paramount Plus across all 28 countries that they operate in. They don't all operate in 28 countries, but across all of the countries they operated in. Of all of the titles, and it's almost 600,000 titles, which is pretty scary, really, but only about 13,000 are sports. So it's not a huge number, but then you kind of wouldn't have expected that because some of it is live. But the thing that's really interesting is that this really shows pretty convincingly who's gone into it most heavily. And the big three, Amazon, Netflix, and Disney Plus are the ones that have really seemed to be investing pretty heavily in sports programming, with Paramount Plus much smaller. So Amazon, for example, they say Amazon, of all of the sports programming that was provided by those services, Amazon produces just over a third, and Netflix about a quarter, and Disney also about a third, Disney Plus about a third, and Paramount Plus just 6.5%. And remember, we're talking about multiple countries, not just the US. So I don't think this is reflective of what's going on in the US. For example, I don't think Disney Plus is as heavy into sports in the US as it is in other regions. So anyway, that gives you I think, a pretty interesting snapshot of where the sports programming is coming from. And Amazon has been using sports very strategically in pretty much every region it operates in. So, for example, it licenses soccer in the UK just before Christmas, which is, it's a great way of getting people to subscribe to Prime and buying in the Prime store for the Christmas shopping rush. So that sort of really gives you a snapshot there of what's going on. So that's content composition. One of the interesting things, I've never seen this before, Will, and they've really given us a snapshot of where the companies are producing their content, in which geographic regions. And it really reinforces one of the things that Netflix has been brought to the market pretty strongly, and that is that it is now an international producer of content. And of the 5 services that are listed here, Paramount Plus, Disney Plus, Prime Video, and Apple TV Plus, Netflix produces the least in the US. About a third of the originals that it is producing in Q2 2025 are being produced in the US. The rest are coming globally. Great Britain, about 10%. South Korea. Now we know Netflix is heavily into South Korea with Squid Game and all of the other South Korean content that they have. That's also a big source. About 8% of the content that is produced by Netflix is produced there. But they're also big in France and Japan. And really, I think the only other thing to say here is that Great Britain is a big beneficiary of content production. Pretty much all of the providers that they talk about are producing a significant amount of content in Great Britain. So that's another popular place for the production. But this really reinforces how important international production of content is to Netflix now, and also kind of why Netflix was less affected by the strikes, the writers and the actors strike a couple of years ago than anybody else, because so much of their content is being produced outside of the US. And the last one I want to mention is genres. And this is like an interesting snapshot. Basically, again, Gracenote is giving us a picture of the number of titles in a particular genre that each service has. And honestly, I've never seen anything quite as detailed as this. So it's pretty interesting to look at. But one of the things it really reinforces is that not all the services are the same. Now, of course, all of them have plenty of drama, plenty of comedy. But what this really shows is that, for example, if you like anime, don't go to Apple TV Plus and don't go to Paramount Plus because they haven't got any. But Disney Plus and Netflix do have plenty of anime. And again, it also some surprises. I've always associated Paramount Plus with lots of science fiction. Well, it turns out, at least according to Gracenote, only about 4% of the titles at Paramount Plus are related to science fiction, whereas in Netflix also has about 3%, and Apple TV has much more, has 6%. So if you're into science fiction and you're subscribed to Paramount Plus, you probably need Apple TV Plus too, and that's certainly true for me. I'm very much enjoying the new series Murderbot on Apple TV Plus. So anyway, this is a fascinating snapshot of the content catalogs of these services, and well worth you taking a look at.
Yeah, I agree. It was very revealing, and just on your last point, it seemed like when I look over the genres, in addition to the notes that you made, it looks like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it looks like comedy and drama are kind of like the mainstays across all the different services. There are some like, Disney that has a bigger catalog in kids programming, children's programming, but primarily it's comedy and drama, right?
That's what's driving all of these services. There's no question about that, Will.
Yeah.
The other thing is, if you like movies, apparently you need to have Amazon Prime Video. Although I have to say, I have it, and I really don't watch very many movies on there. But apparently there's a lot of stuff, a lot of movies on Prime Video. I mean, it really dominates the category, at least according to Gracenote. One question, I need to reach out to the folks at Gracenote and ask them this, but I'm just wondering if the titles that they're including in Prime Video also includes the SVODs that you can buy via Amazon channels. I suspect not, but I should probably double check that it does not. That would obviously change things a lot because, of course, one of the big business models for Prime Video, as we saw from the antenna data, is reselling SVOD services. And when Prime Video sells those, people come to Prime Video to then watch that content from another SVOD service like Paramount Plus or whatever. So I just wanted to double check that they aren't counting that viewing inside of the Prime Video, but I'll double check that.
Agree. And also just adding two quick notes. One, when you talked about content composition focusing on sports, just to zoom out one level, Gracenote shows the percentages of content for each provider at an all programs level. And I think we've discussed this before, but Amazon has by far the most number of overall programs, 67.4% of total volume of programs on Amazon. That is almost, or actually it is over 3 times as much as the next one, which is Netflix, and 20%, and then on down from there, Disney Plus at 9.1%. So Amazon, in addition to playing the sports game and the movie game, is very, overall is the kind of 800-pound gorilla in terms of sheer number of titles.
It certainly is. But what this reinforces to me, Will, is it's not quantity, it's quality. And while Amazon has a very, very large library of titles, every data that I've seen suggests that viewing of Prime Video is much lower than some of the others. But maybe that's a good time for us to transition to your discussion of Nielsen's The Gauge data, because that has a snapshot of how much TV viewing is actually going to Prime Video.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, The Gauge, new data from The Gauge for April of 2025, and The Gauge is, for those who haven't seen it, it's the Nielsen's total TV and streaming snapshot. So a couple of points worth making here. Streaming now is 44.3% of total viewing, followed by cable 24.5%, and then broadcast again slipping this month to 20.8%. Within streaming, I would say my overall take is that things didn't change that much from March of 25, from the prior month. When I look at the data, YouTube is still at the top, and now I'm looking at The Gauge data, monthly TV viewing by distributor, not by platform, but by distributor. YouTube is still number one, actually jumped up from, or nudged up rather, wouldn't call it a jump, but nudged up from 12% of viewing by distributor, 12.4% in April, followed by Disney. All these numbers are give or take comparable to March. They're all less than 1% different. So Disney bumped up from 10.5% in March to 10.7% in April. Paramount was increased from 8.5% to 8.9%. NBC Universal from 8% even to 8.2%. Netflix from 7.9%, nudged down a bit to 7.5%. So, YouTube really continues to become the biggest player of viewership by distributor. And there have been a number of different articles and interviews recently with YouTube executives, certainly coming out of the New Fronts presentations, that they are all in on connected TV viewing. They're also very much focused on YouTube Shorts, which are now often viewed on TVs as well. And so this data is now coming through on the gauge as it continues. YouTube continues to be the the big driver here of viewership.
It does, and the interesting thing looking at that data, Will, is, as you said, by distributor. When you look at the attribution given to Disney, that includes all of Disney's D2C properties and all of their traditional television properties.
Right.
That are, and what Nielsen is doing is they're aggregating all that viewership together. And when you think about it, it's pretty amazing because back in January, basically the amount of TV time people spent with all of Disney's content was about the same as they spent with YouTube on TV. And since then, YouTube has maintained its lead and has actually extended its lead over Disney over that period. And that really speaks, I think, very strongly to just how powerful this YouTube model continues to be. There was some interesting data out this week as well that was talking, it came from Digital Eye, was talking about how nostalgia was driving viewing among SVODs, and there was no question. I was looking at Netflix data, and Prison Break, which released in the second half. It's an old Fox show, 5 seasons of Prison Break, released on Netflix. And it was if you add all of the viewing up of all of the seasons of Prison Break, it beat every other show available on Netflix in the second half. Listen to this, 1.5 billion hours watched of Prison Break in the second half of 2024, which is pretty darn amazing. But here's the thing: originals are still very important. They're still a critical part of the mix, and that is what you get with YouTube. Every time you go and look at YouTube, this is original content. Usually you're not, I suppose there are times when you're looking for library, but the things that bring us in, the new releases, are when we get pinged by one of our content providers that we follow, telling us that they have a new title, and that gets us going in there and watching. And so that's totally originals driven. So very, very powerful model.
Yeah, we won't talk about the rabbit hole effect either when you get on YouTube and you just get served up more and more videos and you just keep watching more and more, and before you know it, an hour has evaporated, right?
Yeah, it's funny because it's actually, I've been thinking about YouTube in quite a different way recently. And remember how we used to just stick on some TV channel and let that play in the background of your life? Well, you can do that with YouTube now. You just find something that's vaguely interesting to you, and YouTube will just continue to serve it up in this custom channel just for you. So, it's pretty interesting, that.
I think that's right. Well, let's go ahead into our final 2 stories here. First, changes in the kids' content space that you've been following.
Yeah, it's like people are swapping the kids' content in their catalogs. So 2 stories in the last week, Will, that have really been interesting to me. The first is that CoComelon, which was picked up by Netflix from YouTube. YouTube was sort of the first place that CoComelon emerged. Netflix plucked it off of YouTube and has had it since 2020, I think, in their library. And it's been a key part of their kids' content. And, well, apparently they didn't want to renew for some reason. And it was, actually, in the piece on Deadline, it wasn't clear why it was moving from Netflix. It wasn't clear whether Netflix had decided it wasn't drawing enough viewing anymore and decided to not bid, or they were outbid by Disney Plus, but it is moving to Disney Plus. So that was one story. The other story, which I'm sure people heard last week, was that Sesame Street is moving from Max to Netflix. So In fact, the way it's been pitched in the media is that Netflix is saving Sesame Street. Of course, Sesame Street has been a mainstay on PBS stations around the country for decades. And certainly the release on NPR on PBS doesn't pitch it as Netflix saving Sesame Street. I think they're probably pretty comfortable with providing Sesame Street through there. But anyway, that is coming to bolster Netflix libraries after it is losing CoComelon. And interestingly, if we go back to this Gracenote data, one of the things that we see is just how strong Disney is in children's. In fact, of the 5 different services that Gracenote mentioned, Disney is by far and away the heaviest into children's content. They say about over 17% of Disney Plus's content library is children's oriented. So that CoComelon stuff, I mean, it's fresh stuff, I guess, for the kids to see. Those people using Disney Plus haven't seen that before. Netflix actually is quite a bit weaker. Only about 7% of the titles on Netflix are children's content. So, Disney will continue to dominate, and probably didn't feel they needed Sesame Street. CoComelon is just sort of icing on the cake for Disney. But Netflix, I think, really did need something to replace the CoComelon stuff. So anyway, interesting switching locations for that content.
Exactly. And the worth mentioning that the kids programming is very sticky for a streaming service. So it's a real churn buster. Kids don't want to give up the favorite programs that they have. And so it only helps from a family churn reduction standpoint. So, Colin, we're just going to wrap with a quick one here at the end. And that is, I'm sure many of our listeners are following AI video generation these days. And late last week, Google released the 3rd version of Veo 3, which is its new AI video generator. And I've read a bunch of different articles about it and also watched some videos that were created with it, as well as some other tools. For instance, Wall Street Journal created a short movie using Veo 3 and Runway and a couple of other tools. And I just have to say, from my standpoint, it's pretty amazing to see what AI can now generate, what type of video AI can now generate. And it's a brave new world. These tools are developing very rapidly, and going back to our discussion of YouTube, and what was called user-generated content is now creator economy, and one can see the evolution of some portion of premium video being generated by AI and it establishing a pretty sizable audience. So I don't know if you agree with that or not, Colin, but that's sort of what I'm envisioning unfolding here in the years to come.
Yeah, me too. The clips that we were looking at on The Verge, or at least I was looking at on The Verge, Will, are very, very convincing. It's very hard to tell that this is not real. We're not actually seeing something that is real people doing real things. It's very, very hard to tell. And we should link this to one other thing that we found this week, which was on Google's Notebook LM. Google's Notebook LM will produce for you, if you give it a whole bunch of information, it will produce a podcast for you with a couple of people chatting back and forth about the data that you gave it. And this also is incredibly realistic and actually quite engaging. So yes, this is a brave new world. I don't know exactly where this is taking us.
Nobody does.
But it means that I think anything you see, any video purporting to show anything, you should question the source and really go back and look at the source, because if it's coming from somewhere that isn't a recognized news outlet, it's probably not real.
Right. Disinformation age turbocharged, right?
You bet.
Well, let's leave it on that happy note, Colin. We covered a lot of ground here today, and no doubt we'll have more next week. So good chatting with you, and listeners, we'll see you again next week.
Inside the Stream is a production of In-Screen Media and Video News, all rights reserved.